All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the Competitive Intelligence Working Group on Sponsor Analysis. Keith, if you can go to the next slide. We are here today, as LJ mentioned, for They Want What, the role of CI in understanding sponsors. Next slide, please. And so today we'll start with, Keith will start with an overview of competitive intelligence, just since this is the first session of this academic year, and we've had a lot of new participants in the CI working group. We thought it would be great to start with just a broad overview of competitive intelligence. And then Keith will go through what exactly a sponsor analysis is, and then we'll walk through the process for how to complete this kind of analysis, as well as how you might need to pivot your messaging dependent on your audience. And then we'll end with some really concrete examples. I know a lot of this, it's very, very helpful, but it's a lot of information. And so we'll end with some examples. So when you're back at your desk, you have something back to refer to. And then we'll finish up with discussion. As we go through, we do have Slido. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. We'll be looking at that. Or you can unmute and just ask, either way, whatever you're most comfortable with. And with that, I will pass it to Keith.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. Hold on. So like Jamie said, we're going to just start off with the overview of what is competitive intelligence, just as a refresher for some of this may be repetitive for people who this is pulled from our presentation last year. So I guess to start off is, what do you think of when you hear competitive intelligence? Again, you can go to slido.com or sli.do and then enter that hashtag. We have 4 or 5 Slido questions throughout the presentation to just kind of get a little feedback early on. So then we see kind of some funder research, strategic insights.
I think smart sports may be one of my favorite answers.
And the ever-present spies. So I'll come back to those. So that's a good start. That is something that we hear, hackers or spies, or doing awesome visualizations, but when in fact what we do is kind of sit in front of the computer and gather data and information and transform it. And that's a better definition of competitive intelligence is it's the ethical collection of data and information to inform decision making. Another way to think of it is that we're not just trying to collect data and transform it into information. We're trying to take that information and then analyze it to create actionable insights for leadership. Our focus is to be strategic to advance the goals of the organization or stakeholder. It's to be unbiased, to go in without a predetermined answer, to gather the information that we need to make good recommendations, but not go in seeking to advocate from the beginning. We use both qualitative and quantitative measures. To build trust, having measurable quantitative data is very helpful. And then we want, again, like I said, to be actionable. We're not here to provide information that is nice to know. We want to improve decision making, enhance decision making, so that the organization is stronger and can position itself better strategically in the future. And just as a core concept that we want to bring into our work is we want to have repeatable procedures, and that is whether it's having a product that we are do a number of times so that we have a better process. Having repeatable processes leads to better processes because you know what to look for, and you develop better checklists and whatnot. Before I actually get into this, I'll pull Slido back up to see if we had any more answers. How to strategically grow a space, quantitative and qualitative research. Okay, that was the top. In-depth knowledge, information gathering, landscape analysis, position. So there's a range of what people think of. So to give more context again for newer people, competitive intelligence has its role in the private sector and industry. So whether it's apparel companies, telecom companies, or defense contractors, they're all competing for market share. So they're competing with other companies. They need to know their markets, where they can sell their products, what those products are, and how they're positioned. what are the other industries that are involved in terms of supply chain, what does their vendor network look like, and who are their customers. So in the private sector, competitive intelligence can easily be seen where it's of benefit in those areas. So one of the things that this working group does, and that we started at ASU, is understanding how this process could be used in universities, and how does this enhance the research enterprise. And it actually maps pretty well. So our competitors are our faculty. We're not competitors on this call. We're all striving to be better intelligence analysts. And so that makes us a network. Our competitors are our faculty who are competing for money, sometimes partnering. But the markets are those funding opportunities that they are competing for. The product is their research expertise. The industry are the research fields that may come together for interdisciplinary work, but are bigger than just what their expertise is in. The vendors are the other assets that they may have access to in terms of facilities or other partnerships, community engagement that they can bring into projects. And last, the customers are the sponsors who are giving them money. So if we kind of take that perspective from the private sector, and how do we then look at these areas to position the university for success in research, we can kind of graft it onto that. So by and large, like, the expertise in research fields are the domain of the researchers. We don't engage in that too much. We may occasionally, but really our bread and butter is in those funding opportunities, the sponsors, and the competitors. And then for us personally at ASU, assets is the next one after that. The CI process is kind of a standard research process. It's not magical. We start with the planning process. We move into that data and information collection so that we can analyze it, transform it to give it to our stakeholder. We also have the dream sometimes of teaching this to others so that they can do it themselves. So that's why that last one has dissemination, which is us giving it to someone else, or implementation if they're doing it for themselves. Or if you even find this, you're doing it for yourself, is that part of that process. So I'm going to pop these up pretty quickly. So with the planning process, you need to know the motivation. What's sparking the need for the request? What are the key questions you're trying to answer? Checklists are very valuable just in terms of making sure that you're asking either stakeholders, your clients, the right questions, or just that you have a form document and you're addressing all the things that you need to address. You want to understand your audience. Jamie's going to be going into this more later with regards to the sponsor analysis, but I think for any product, whether it's to faculty, a center leader, leadership, who your audience is affects the kind of questions that you want to ask, and what kind of answers you need to provide. And the last one is manage expectations, which is both for your clients so that they understand what you can do, but it's also manage your own expectations about what you're able to provide. And that some of that comes with experience and knowing what data and information is available where you can make your recommendations from. And the next part is the collection. And as an analyst, it's easy to, you need to start from somewhere. So you need to develop that basic understanding. And as you keep in mind your key questions, you're advancing that process and you're getting those answers. And I think it's very important to, if you haven't engaged other people, human intelligence we found to be very valuable. And over the last 2 years here at ASU, we've made a bigger effort in that regard in terms of reaching out to other universities, talking to people internally, because the information they can provide is not something that's going to be available from a database or a web search or even a press release. It can be biased, and you need to take that into account, but that human intelligence is very valuable and can illuminate reports and other documents a great deal. And I think the important part of collection is also knowing when to stop, because it's easy to get into rabbit holes or just wanting to find more and more. But if you keep in mind your key questions, I think that's easier to find out when to stop. So with the analysis process, it is iterative with collection. It's not meant to be purely after, it's meant to be done somewhat at the same time. And while you're doing that analysis, you want to remain objective. You want to remain focused on what your objective is, what the key questions are, but also objective in your analysis so that you stay unbiased. Because the goal here is to identify patterns and themes in the analysis that you can, that are addressing your key questions. And as you do this more and more, you'll develop good methodologies and tools to help either make the process go faster, to develop better insights. So this could be, what sources you're looking for and how you break down data. If you like to aggregate in a certain way, and being able to explain that to your stakeholders. And the last one is to be mindful of the gaps in your research, either things that you weren't able to find or the caveats that you may have in your data, because that develops trust with your stakeholder by being fair about what you don't know or what you were not able to find. The next step is that transformation of you've done the analysis and getting it ready to present to your stakeholder. And that's about building those networks and connections among the information that you found to create actionable findings that lead them to make better decisions, to take better actions. And in a research setting, also to help inform their story. How does it make a better story for what they're trying to tell? Because, if you get into whether it's the university selling itself to a sponsor or a researcher in a proposal, they're telling a story that needs to be impactful with a funding agency or funding source. So our tagline for why is CI useful is there kind of in the background. It's a matter of time. It's an upfront investment of time that then provides value longer term because it helps with that decision making rather than spending a lot of time on something and not being prepared for it. It just provides better background. It identifies opportunities and weaknesses that the university may have. It improves the planning processes by knowing what's happening in the near and long term. And then it also avoids surprises and reduces risks for leadership by just being better informed. So with that, our next Slido question is, what kind of CI do you offer or do? And then do you have any kind of specific products that you offer to your stakeholders or at your home institution? And I'll give everybody a minute to answer that, and I'll pop up the replies momentarily. All right. So again, CI is a new function at universities. So you may have products that are CI, and you may not necessarily be thinking of that in a sense. But we do see the peer analysis, sponsor funding trends, corporate strategy. Obviously, competitive intelligence is a secret, so that's a good one. All right. So now this is just kind of a broad overview of our core products. We do, these are kind of our core basic products that we offer ASU that look internally, our capacity analysis. We also do a competitive landscape that focuses on other universities generally, and then the sponsors, which can be a funding landscape, a sponsor analysis, which is the focus of the rest of this presentation, and program analyses, which are specific programs. And then so that's kind of the layout. And then we also do strategic projects, which may glom some of these together or even blow out one of these in a bigger way. So first, what is a sponsor analysis? So a sponsor analysis at its core is trying to figure out what a specific sponsor plans to fund. There's a longer definition there on the right that I'll let you read. So then why do a sponsor analysis? I think there's three kind of core pillars to a sponsor analysis. One is understanding the organizational structure of either whether it's a federal agency or a nonprofit or any kind of funding source, to know where how they're set up, what their goals and priorities are, which is that second one. What are they looking to fund? What are the structures in the organization, and then how does the money flow? And I'll give kind of examples of each of these three. The first one is kind of an example of using U.S. Department of Agriculture. ASU is not a land grant institute, so we do not have a huge amount of money from USDA, and therefore the knowledge of the organization is not well known, because from our experience, and this may pop up throughout, is faculty may have the tendency to respond to opportunities rather than understanding an organization to see where the best fit for their money is. So if we, if somebody is interested in USDA, understanding the organization is a good first step in terms of knowing that most of their research funding will come through the Research Education Economics Division, and that it has 4 core units, one of which is an intramural group, the Agricultural Research Service, which is not a primary funding source. Economic Research Service has some money, but is not necessarily huge buckets, but the bulk of it's going to come from NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. So being able to lay this out in a more documentable format, helps researchers know where to target their money. It helps leadership maybe know, who to interact with within an agency, for example. So just being able to lay that out and being able to give them something succinct rather than them having to obviously dig through a website and kind of piece it together. The second start is their funding priorities, and these can come from strategic plans. It will come from budget documents, which have different uses. But one good example here is the NSF's 10 Big Ideas, which they rolled out back in 2016 and 17. And again, going back to the idea that people may be responding to opportunities rather than understanding the organization. If they're not aware of the 10 Big Ideas, they don't know how that kind of drifts down into the other programmatic work that NSF does. So being able to, get that word out that, if you're in biological sciences, addressing their goals for rules of life would be beneficial in even your programmatic work, I think is a benefit. And so that this is where understanding what the large goals of an organization and entity are can be beneficial to both leadership and the researchers. And the last one is the money flow. And this is just understanding how they're actually allocating money. This could be looking at past awards and using the past award databases that are available on various funding agency sites. Philanthropic foundations will also have histories of past awards. You can also look at budget documentation. I just threw up DoD because nobody likes going through the DoD budget. But if you're actually able to tease out stuff that helps your university, it's there's money there. And DoD is a challenging entity to kind of crack if your university hasn't done it yet, just because it's not as streamlined as something like NSF. So understanding how the money flows and where those connections are, again, those are kind of the 3 main areas that I look at in a sponsor analysis and kind of developing recommendations for leadership. And with that, I will hand it over to Jamie.
Thanks, Keith. So Keith has given us a really good baseline for competitive intelligence. And so if you go to the next slide, Keith, I'm going to walk through the process that he laid out: planning, analyzing, collecting, transforming, and apply it specifically to what you want to do for sponsor analysis. And so for the planning process, this really starts, and I would recommend that you meet with your stakeholder and have just a conversation so you can really understand what they're needing, and then you can start your planning so that you make sure you provide something useful to them. And so the first thing is, determining motivation, and you might want to ask your stakeholder, what has prompted this need for this analysis? And really that helps you get at defining the key question. So what does your stakeholder need to know? And when you ask that question, really actively listen, because you'll learn, they'll tell you what they want to know, they'll tell you what's prompted the analysis, but if you're actively listening, you can also start to figure out where there might be gaps, where they maybe have a blind spot of something they really do need to know, and they don't even know it yet. And so, kind of having this conversation will really help you create a checklist, because as you're actively listening to all of the things they want to know, they need to know, those gaps of information you're seeing as an analyst, you can create this checklist about the information that you need to collect. And then the key part of this that we'll come back to is really understanding your audience. And so when you meet with that initial stakeholder, maybe that is your end stakeholder, maybe they're a liaison for the end stakeholder, but keep in mind if your audience is primarily a faculty member, a leader at your institution, or someone else. And that's really crucial because how you pivot your messaging about sponsors and what is important to know about the sponsor can change and vary dependent on your audience. So you just want to keep that in mind as an analyst. And then the last bit of this planning process is really to manage expectations. And so you want to be sure that you create a realistic picture of what you can offer. There may be information that a sponsor or that a stakeholder wants to know about a sponsor that's just not available. And that's fair, but you have to, be really upfront about what you can and can't do, and then really clear about what a sponsor analysis itself will cover. As Keith mentioned before, we also at our university do program analyses. And so those are a different product. And we want to be really clear about which product a stakeholder truly needs. Are they looking at a specific program? Is that what they need? Or do they need information about an entire sponsor? Next, please. And so on the screen at the top really is just a bunch of things Keith and I could think of that you might want to collect. And there's more you can add, but some of this might not be relevant. And it really comes down to, Keith, if you click next, back to that collection. You have to start with your basic understanding, of course, and then keeping in mind your key question, going back to your initial conversation with the stakeholder, you'll start to create your checklist of which may include some of this information at the top, dependent on what answers your key question. And so, you want to go through this and figure out which bits of information are useful to collect, as well as knowing when to stop. If a stakeholder is really interested in the budget, then you'll have to dig through the budget. If they're not really interested in the budget, you should still go through the budget and provide some of that information, but you might want to provide some other information as well. So there's just a kind of mix and match here of things you need to collect. Next slide, please. And then our next step of our process is that analysis. And so again, this is very iterative with collection. As you start analyzing data, you may realize you need to collect additional data. And then, of course, remaining objective. And really with a sponsor analysis, this is pretty crucial because sponsors have put out information, right? And if you change or paraphrase that information, quotes from a sponsor, you might actually change the meaning. And so part of remaining objective as you do a sponsor analysis is being really clear about when you are quoting a sponsor and when you are paraphrasing what a sponsor needs, or when you've taken kind of that next leap in your analysis to say this is, kind of what this might mean, or you're doing some kind of, transformation of the direct quote to identify those patterns and themes. But you want to be really clear about which part of this process you're at with your stakeholder. So is it a direct quote, or are you kind of finding patterns and themes that the sponsor themselves has not said? And that's just, again, getting back to making sure that the analysis is objective. And then really with methodologies and tools, what can be really helpful about providing your methodology to your sponsor analysis is really that when you go through, you develop your methodology. So internally as an analyst, that's really helpful because now when you do another sponsor analysis, you have a methodology. But it's also very helpful for your stakeholder to understand your methodology because it lets them know exactly what you've looked at, what you haven't looked at, how you've analyzed it. And again, it all gets back to being objective, remaining unbiased, sharing your process. And in an ideal world, if you share your methodology, maybe the next time someone wants to come to you, maybe they'll have done some of the digging themselves. And so it's teaching your process, it's maintaining it for yourself, and then making sure that you're very clear about what your process includes. And then lastly, of course, those gaps. And so when you find gaps, that might lead you back to the beginning of your analysis process to iterate, to collect, and so on and so forth. And you'll just keep going through the process. Next slide, please. And then the last step of the process is transformation. And transformation is really how you go from taking tons of data that you've looked at, both qualitative and quantitative, and start to create an actual report. And I will say this process of transformation, it varies. And it varies depending on three things. So the first is the audience. And we'll talk through how your transformation of information should vary dependent on your audience in our next section. but it also varies dependent on your specific stakeholder. And so as you work with stakeholders multiple times and you have repeat customers, you can get an idea of the things you like. If it's, you working with someone for the first time, you can just ask them what they like. And so some people would prefer data and tables. They kind of want to get into the data themselves. Others would prefer just a quick summary, 1-page, brief analysis. And so you want to ask your stakeholder what they're looking for. Again, this is all about kind of meeting them where they're at and providing something useful. And then the other bit is that how you transform data really kind of depends on you as an analyst, right? We all have our preferences when we start writing. And so being aware of your preferences is really beneficial. I know as an analyst, I really like to write. And sometimes I can write something, and then I'll send it to Keith before I send it to a stakeholder. And he'll say, oh, this is too convoluted, like just make it a table. And Keith is the opposite. He really likes data. And so sometimes he'll put together a table and he'll send it to me and I'll say, I don't get this part. I need more context. And so, having a sounding board, having someone in your office who can really ensure that how you're transforming data doesn't just speak to you as an analyst, but really will speak to a stakeholder is really beneficial. So find like your partner and ask them, hey, can you look at this? Can you check this? It's just really helpful. You get really deep information. You're in the weeds on these. And so you have to make sure that you can bring it back up to a level and really convey your message. Next slide. And the whole point of conveying your message is really, again, to highlight those networks and connections for your faculty and your leaders to a sponsor, to put out actionable findings. You cannot put out an actionable finding if someone can't follow your message. And so that's where it's really beneficial to make sure that you're speaking to a specific stakeholder and you're aware of your own preferences as an analyst, and you're speaking to a specific audience. All of this is, again, to inform your overall story. If you click next, I know this is very theoretical at this point, and so we will have examples in a few slides that really will show exactly how some of this data gets transformed. And then I just want to walk through a few additional tips, and these are really tips for impact. And so they're kind of just takeaway messages for this process. It's, of course, managing your expectations. You can't boil the ocean is something I keep in mind. So if you're detailing an entire sponsor, maybe that is what's needed for this stakeholder. Maybe it's not. Maybe, they don't need to know all of NIH. Maybe they're focused on a specific institute, and you can profile, NIAID, or you can profile exactly what they need to know. So kind of creating those expectations and making sure you target your message. Next. And then really paying attention to formatting. And so it's hard with a lot of data to make it look good. And it does take that little bit of extra effort, but people want to read things that look nice. And so if you can get someone to pick up your document and they, are intrigued by it, that's really, really powerful. Next is distilling your message, which really goes back into formatting as well. Making sure that you give them the facts right up front that they need to know. You put your recommendations right at the front. We have a best practice in our office that we call the inverted triangle. And so oftentimes, in academia, we're trained to kind of spell out all of our data and then form a conclusion. And really for CI work, we kind of flip that. And so right at the front, we have all of the recommendations, the key takeaways, and then we put in all of the, well, here's how I discovered all of that. And really what that means is that if a stakeholder doesn't read past page 2, they've gotten all the really crucial information. And then if they really want to get some more proof or they need to understand the message a bit deeper, then they can go beyond the couple of pages you've provided. And so distilling your message is just really crucial for making sure the message really gets out there to your stakeholder. Next is human intelligence. And so Keith mentioned this earlier, human intelligence is just really valuable. There's things that you can find in a database that are great, but there are also things you just cannot find in a database. And so for a sponsor analysis, talking to your faculty, talking to the sponsor if you can, is really beneficial because there's just going to be things that you're just not going to be aware of from things like press releases, right? So where you can build connections to sponsors or where you can leverage the connections your faculty have built to sponsors, that can be really powerful. And then lastly is actionable recommendations. And so actionable recommendations are just really beneficial. That's what takes something from being very informative to being intelligence. And so that leap to intelligence is all about making sure that you are actually informing decision making. And to do that, you have to provide something someone can, have a plan to do something with. And so you don't just want to say, here's what the sponsor cares about. You want to say, here's what the sponsor cares about, and here's what you as a stakeholder can now do with that information. And with that, I'll pass it back to Keith, who's put together just a nice summary of our process.
Yeah, so this is just it's part process, it's part just a summary of, like, in developing a sponsor analysis, really focusing on the background of the entity first and looking at their org structure. Again, you see those bullet points underneath before really getting into where the money is, and then understanding, how they allocate, what if they have any kind of unique programs, and spelling out those programs. So in some of the examples that Jamie will show, a sponsor analysis is not a program analysis. Program analysis is a different product we do. But oftentimes, again, faculty or leadership may be thinking in terms of what the new opportunity is, and even just like providing a list of what standard programs are can be beneficial. But so, and just understanding what that flow is like. And then the last, again, is then transforming that and targeting it to who your audience is and what is the information that needs to be there that will most resonate and be most useful. But I think that thing of, like, because you want to start with anything with having an understanding of the organization, you really need to start there, and then again, money to audience. And as you do it repetitively, if you come back to it, then you can kind of skip through that part of that first step and get just like, what are they doing with their money now? But it's still kind of, that's the natural flow of it. And then we have another Slido. So how do you share information about sponsors in your organization? Do you do anything similar to a sponsor analysis? Or do you get asked with information on a specific sponsor and maybe not at the programmatic level? And this could be any sponsor, whether it's federal, philanthropic, or other.
I'd love to hear more about, when we get to the discussion, kind of the newsletter side of sharing information about sponsors. We're doing a bi-weekly newsletter now on our team that really has information about sponsors. And I'd love to hear more about other practices from people who've maybe done it a bit longer.
All right. And then come back to knowing your oh, sorry.
All good.
Are you ready to?
Yeah. So for Know Your Audience, I'll go through the two audiences we typically have at ASU for our sponsor analyses, which are faculty and leadership. And so for faculty, understanding a sponsor really can help them position their proposals and their research. And the goal of this kind of analysis is to show faculty what a sponsor is looking for and re-emphasize that their research must align with those sponsor objectives. And so really you're moving faculty who may primarily be looking at funding opportunity announcements to strategically looking at the sponsor and program levels and to analyze fit. And so they're figuring out, okay, is this the right sponsor for me? How do I fit in? How does my research and my messaging need to pivot to fit this sponsor? And I will say these analyses for faculty are typically pretty quick to do, and they're highly informational. When we did these, we were asked to do a number of one-pagers, and so I'll have the examples here in a few slides, but those were pretty quick to put together because they were highly informational. They really focused on the structure of the organization, and again, they were very targeted. And so, sitting with your faculty member and really understanding, do they need to know all of NSF or do they need to know a specific directorate? And then getting deeper information on that directorate versus kind of broad information on NSF and how that will help them. We always, for faculty, like to include past institutional awards and who has won, lots of funding from a specific sponsor. It's just really nice. Faculty can help start building their network. They can hear, information and tips and strategies from other faculty, which can also be really powerful. So they get not only the analyst side of what we're seeing, but they get that human intelligence side from faculty by us just providing those names of here's who's done well with the sponsor. And really, for a sponsor analysis for faculty, these are very tactical. They are helping a faculty member who is ready to make a decision to submit a proposal for something right then. And then for leadership, things look a little bit different. And so for leadership, understanding a sponsor can help leaders at your institution position your university, position your research objectives to best align with the sponsor. And so you're mapping a sponsor's needs to institutional capacity, saying this is what a sponsor wants, here's who we have that meets that. And these are really strategic. They are kind of ideally helping your institution move from being reactive to a sponsor saying, hey, we want this thing, to being proactive in that you understand and anticipate what a sponsor might want, and you're already positioning your resources to meet the moment at that time. These are very deep analyses because they're future looking. And I will say sponsor analyses for leadership, they take some time. They are a big lift, but they are really, really beneficial to leadership. And because they're future looking, they can help you position, not just your resources for today, but what might be coming. You have to be very clear that, you are making the leap there, and you want to be very clear about how you've gathered information to create this future look. And again, because it's future looking, that human intelligence aspect is so, so crucial. You have to be talking to people, both faculty at your institution, learning, about what they're hearing about sponsors and things of that nature, and tying that into, the research you're doing as an analyst. And again, these are a lot of information. You will collect a ton of information, but you have to keep it actionable. Otherwise, you're giving a stakeholder a lot of information and not a whole lot they can really do with it. So really spell that out for your leadership. Put that right at the top. Here's what you need to be doing if you want to go after whichever sponsor, and then add all of your proof following that. Next. Yeah, so next up we have just another Slido question. And really those are our primary stakeholders at ASU, our faculty and our leadership, but we were just curious if you have other stakeholders. So seeing a mix of answers between faculty and leadership, it looks like primarily faculty teams. So that's really great. I do like the answer myself. That's always, you got to learn about a sponsor too. So that's helpful. That's great. All right, so with that, it seems like we have some of similar audiences. So we'll kind of go through how do you present this information dependent on your audience. And so this goes back to our earlier slides where I talked about transformation and how you transform information. This is, at least at ASU, how we do that. So for our faculty, I just have a few examples. On the screen is an example of a NASA document that we put together. So this was, again, a lot of what we talked about. It has the executive summary. It has a section about NASA. It has NASA's mission, their organizational structure, strategic themes and goals, and then potential research focus areas. And then if you click next, from the other pages, we did a bit more on what their strategic objectives are, kind of providing our faculty really quick information about those strategic objectives, as well as, if you click next, the NASA administrator objectives. And so being aware of leadership at a sponsor, especially when leaders change at a sponsor, and noting the new incoming person's preferences, that's going to change how the sponsor functions, right? They're leading the organization, they have their own objectives. And so highlighting those objectives is really beneficial to understanding where a sponsor may be going. And then next is just, again, that synergy with ASU capabilities. So that's what takes this from being highly informational to a little bit more actionable, understanding where your institution might have a play with the sponsor. And then, so a while ago, we were asked to create these one-pagers, is what we ended up calling them. And they are one page front and back of really quick information for faculty about specific parts of a sponsor. And so what we found was that, or what we were told really, was that some faculty were applying to the right sponsor overall. They were doing NSF or NIH, but they weren't targeting to the right directorates or institutes. And so we created these quick one-pagers that really have just an overview of what the specific directorate looks to fund, has the budget for that directorate, their research priorities. And then if you click next, Keith, Keith created this really great second page that breaks down not only the directorate, but it shows all of the divisions, as well as the programs and cross-cutting initiatives within those divisions. And all of this is linked. And so while it's not a program analysis, because we were asked to do this quick sponsor analysis, we wanted to give faculty the opportunity to go and explore the programs and kind of show how these programs, funding opportunities they are looking at, really roll up to this larger division, directorate, sponsor level. And so we did that for NSF. We did it for NIH as well. So here you can see the National Cancer Institute. Again, quick overview, research as budgeted, information from their annual plan. And then on the next slide, again, programs and kind of divisions associated with the programs. And then a final note about funding by research category. So again, really quick information for your faculty. And I know it seems like this might not be super helpful because it's so high level, but we were told it was very helpful. So they were easy for us to put together and people got a lot of use out of them. So that's kind of a win-win. For the leadership side, I've got a few examples I'll share. And so the first is the future of national defense. And so a while ago, we were asked really just a basic question, how can ASU grow DoD funding? And so our team did this project as a team. This was, sometimes we work as individual analysts, sometimes we all come together as a team. This was a team project because this took a lot of effort, a lot of work. And so we identified topics that we thought, DoD would be heading in based on intelligence from DoD. So what were they saying they were interested in for war fighting in the future? And so we had those topics you can see at the bottom of the screen. And then if you click next, Keith, for each topic, we outlined ASU capacity, as well as recommendations for advancing, whether it was creating new assets or leveraging existing assets, thinking of creative ways to bring parts of our campus together to kind of meet DoD where they were at or where they were heading. So there's a lot of different ways to think about how you can bring together your institutional resources to recommend something actionable for meeting a sponsor where they're at. And so that's what that document did. And then after we did the DoD document, it was pretty well received. And then we got a note saying, it'd be great if we had one of these on NASA. And so we did another one. And so this one was Space, Expanding ASU's Leadership in the Final Frontier, which really looked at how can ASU grow its NASA funding. And so we had, I think, 4 key takeaways. Yeah, so if you click next, we had 4 key findings. And these key findings were a little bit different. They weren't necessarily focused on where NASA was particularly headed. That seemed to be really well understood at our institution. And so we, of course, had a bit about that because it's a sponsor analysis. But what we really found through human intelligence was that the way we were leveraging resources at ASU could be a little bit different. There was some untapped potential on our campus. And so our key findings were really about how to leverage institutional capacity to meet the sponsor. And this was really well received. So if you click next, Keith, at the time, our Executive Vice President, Dr. Ponch, sent this document to our president, Dr. Crow, And this was the response we got, that it was a great analysis and that, they wanted more. And so that's always really nice to hear from your leaders. And so again, this just kind of goes to show that with these actionable findings, these can be really powerful for leaders as they make decisions. And so those are the examples we have. And then we'll move to discussion. We have 3 discussion questions that we sent out in advance. I know I can see some stuff in the chat that we haven't answered yet, so we'll also answer those questions. So we'll stop our screen share and we can all turn on our videos, unmute, all of that, and just have a little bit of discussion for the remaining time that we have. I'm looking through the questions now, Keith. There's a lot of them, so that's good.
Yeah, I'm just starting at the top. I did look at CDRMP recently. I guess my advice there is I would treat it separate from DoD just because of how it's budgeted. And I think my recollection is that they have some good information and a thorough but not necessarily completely current. My recollection is that their database was like a year off, where it didn't have like the most recent funding. But their appropriations through Congress, I don't really have an answer for that. I think when I looked at it, it wasn't necessarily focused on budgeting, it was focused on past funding history.
See a note from Sharon that says, with respect to that data collection process, should we be sharing more? I mean, I think, yeah, that would be great, especially for the external information. For that internal information, obviously, that's going to be very dependent on, your institution and what your stakeholder is asking. But yes, absolutely. I think that's the power of this community, is that we can share best practices or tips we see. If you do want to share information, we have the listserv as well as the LinkedIn page. And so if you find a really good bit of information, or if we find great information, I know Karen posts a lot on the LinkedIn page, which is always really nice.
Yeah, Jennifer asked about past institutional awards. I think it comes down to the request that's made and what the size of the organization is. I think because for a sponsor analysis, it's trying to figure out trends. So I think looking at the internal sponsors is to find those connections of maybe who's had success, who maybe knows specific program managers, but that generally tends to get down to program analyses. So past awards at the sponsor analysis level, I think is just trying to find trends of like, how are different directorates and how are different big programs being funded? Is it to see what that flow is like? There's none of the databases are great at kind of aggregating the thing that you actually want to know. So an example there would be like if you're making a push in say addiction science. There's stuff within NIH to be able to aggregate by keyword, but trying to see what a sponsor has done. Actually, I'm not going to use NIH as an example because NIH does have different aggregates for how they do different topics. Using a topic that has been of interest to ASU, solar. So if you're going to go to NSF or Department of Energy, and what's their solar energy portfolio look like, that's something that you have to kind of aggregate on your own, to my knowledge. So I think in looking at sponsor awards, I've done sponsor analyses where I've pulled like the last 3 years of everything NSF has done. And that takes a while because you can only do 3,000 at a time. And I think it comes down to, again, what your questions are. And that kind of says on how much you go into it, because I think when you start looking at other institutions and what they're getting funding for, it starts to get into either something that's more programmatic rather than what a sponsor is. But it just becomes, I think, again, just become cumbersome with the bigger agencies because there's just so many awards.
Our next question is for the NSF Geo one pager. How often might you update that? It's a really good question. I will admit we have not updated those in a bit just because we've been doing a lot of other stuff, but we have gotten requests for them. So I'm sure those will be on our list eventually to update. We all are also thinking about, how do we make those a bit more evergreen so that we don't have to update them like all the time, because again, they're quick, but they're still a task. And when you have other things going on, trying to make sure that what we do can be a bit evergreen, reusable where it can be. So that's something we're currently thinking about for the one pagers.
Yeah, for Erica's, Erica had more of a comment on how faculty like the high level overview. And that's kind of a point that we've touched on, is that I think, making the assumption of what faculty do and don't know and how they access information. Again, I think there are some that are, very in tune with what a sponsor does, and those tend to be more experienced faculty who have built a history with a specific sponsor. But a lot of times early career faculty, and as Karen noted, for the one pagers designed for early career faculty, is their first response is to look for opportunities rather than looking for what are the best programmatic fits, even if it's NSF, which is very transparent. Actually going to a directorate page and seeing what their list of programs are. That's what the one pager is about, is to actually put that list in front of them, because that's not information that faculty will always seek out. They are going to grants.gov or something else to find out what the specific opportunity is. So being able to put that information in front of, and then just determine, these are the right directorates, or these are the, the programs that you should be interested in that are on a recurring basis, that are not necessarily hitting grants.gov or Pivot the same way, or whatever your grant finding tools are.
There's a really good question from Sharon in the chat that I'm actually going to ask Karen to answer, just because she's the one that did this. And so it's, are you able to comment on how and who at ASU was persuaded to invest in CI?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's kind of a long story, which I will try to cut short. I think it is something that developed fairly organically. When I began doing CI here at ASU, Dr. Panchanathan was our main client at the time. And as I began to develop, initially I was doing CI and limited submissions at the same time. And so I was trying to develop these CI products. And this is several years ago, probably. I think I initiated this probably back in 2014, 2015. Learning about CI through things like SCIP, Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, and taking those practices and putting them into place here. And developing regular products like the capacity analyses. He really appreciated those because he was just coming in as VPR at the time. And those were very helpful to him. And then starting to do things like program analyses and so forth. So getting an ally like Dr. Ponch was really important and really helpful. And then it just sort of trickled down. And then as the team grew with Keith and then Jamie, and we solidified, as Keith said, we standardized, and we had standard practices and had these regular products that we delivered. It trickled out from Dr. Ponch to other leaders who were getting these regular products that we were delivering. I think it's just a matter of, we were able to create a reputation. Of course, we had Faye Farmer. So, Faye started her group. She said, do you want to come along? And I said, yeah, of course. So Faye was another great champion for CI. So in some ways, it was very fortuitous to have a number of people who were able to champion the CI function here, and who saw the value of it early on. We were able to spread the products and the function and the value of it through leadership. And so I would just say, if you're trying to do this, finding people who can be those sort of connectors and champions and say, hey, look at this, this is really helpful, a helpful function, a helpful product. That's kind of the way to do it. So I hope that's a good answer.
Thanks, Karen. And then I see another question from Alba. Can you tell me how long it takes to build a one-pager and the more in-depth sponsored?
I'll
Okay,
take the first
so-
part. So the first one, the first one pager takes a bit of time. The second one is a lot faster. So when we did that, we initially started off with NIH and NSF. So it was like developing it, it's just essentially developing the template. So we did 5 or 6 for NSF, and I don't think we did all of NIH, but we did.
Pretty close.
It
We did
did
the
a lot of
we did the ones that were most relevant to ASU.
Yeah, the ones that we had the most funding from. So then once the template was set up, it was kind of a plug and play. So maybe a couple of hours, but the first one was just like, okay, how are we gonna manage to fit a lot of this on one page and whatnot? So so it's kind of like pharmaceuticals. So, the first pill costs a lot, the second pill doesn't cost anything.
And the other thing I'll note is that we did split the sponsors. And so that again made it faster because Keith did NSF, I was doing NIH. So it was like you created your methodology once you had it, you knew it. I didn't ever switch to do NSF. He didn't switch to do NIH. We just kind of did what made sense and what was quick. For the strategic sponsor analyses, those take a bit more time. Typically, it is our full team when we do those strategic projects. And I will say they take time, probably a couple months or so, but we are never just working on those strategic projects. So in addition to those strategic projects, we're still answering all of the regular requests that we get. So I guess it's a little harder to gauge the time there, but I would say allocate 3 months probably, dependent on your other workload and also how easy it is to get interviews with people. We're doing a strategic project right now, and just the time of year it is, it's going to be hard to start interviewing people in November, December, given holidays. And so there's some things that can change it, but it does take some time to do those larger analyses, but they're worth it.
Okay, so for Christine's question, to start answer on that, I think some of what you're describing is more in a program analysis or around topical. So we do do reporting that kind of maybe sometimes mixes some of our core products. So it could be sponsor, what their focus is. It could be individual programs. It may also fit into what we call a funding landscape, which is to understand, what's the opportunities for in a specific area. So yeah, so for a topic that's hot like AI, is funding where the money is flowing from NSF. What are the primary directorates? What are the primary programs? Some of that may be in the programmatic language, some of it may be in the abstracts of the awards. And so that all kind of can piecemeal together. And I take a very, did somebody chime in there? I thought I heard
that's the question asker.
Okay.
So
Yes.
This is Chris. What I guess the point that I was trying to make, and what I found really interesting about this group, is there's this, there are sets of people where there are groups like you all who this is your full-time job.
Right.
And then there are others of us where I feel like I foray into some of these projects sometimes.
Mhm.
And I can definitely see the connections with what you've described today.
Mhm.
And I don't know to what extent there's been recognition of the breadth of kind of competitive intelligence types that might be interested in this group. But I found, given where I engage, I guess like some of the more how-to-y stuff, what you said about an individual program or whatever, would be totally helpful to those of us that don't do it as a full-time job.
Mhm.
And so that's looking out into the future. And like everyone has said, this is a totally excellent presentation, but I'm just seeing how it could spin off for those of us that maybe need a little bit more best practice. Anyhow. Thank you.
No, I think that's a really good comment, because right, there are so many on this network that are doing this part of the time or just kind of when they can. And so yes, absolutely. As we do these presentations, Keith and I don't have that perspective just because we are doing it full time, but we welcome that perspective. And if there are specific questions or specific comments that are unique to that, please share them. That is really, really powerful. And then, just the note that if you are doing this part of the time and we had this presentation today, or you want to look back at the program analysis presentation, they're all recorded. And so, if you have any questions as you are doing it maybe a month from now, it'll be there. And if you also want to reach out to us, again, it's a network. And so part of doing it part of the time is that, you can hopefully leverage some of us who are doing it more of our time, and we're happy to share anything we can to help.
And maybe that's something that can develop too via like the listserv, is maybe some bite-sized chunks of kind of, the practice, right? Maybe it's not a great big report. Maybe like we do what we call sometimes like, little data requests or things like that, where it's just, like you're talking about in your question, like just returning like who's been funded for this, or, who are the main competitors for this. And a lot of that is more like data requests, but they can still be useful in informing people when they're moving forward in a proposal or some other activity.
Well, that brings us to our time. If there's anything else anyone wants to discuss, we're of course happy to discuss it. But thank you all for attending. Our next session will be next month, and that'll be on scenario planning. So we hope to see you all there.